before we kick off in earnest. Before we do, just perhaps to run through some of the house rules that we've been operating for these webinars. They will be being recorded, so depending on how you've joined the call, you might be displaying some of your contact details. So if you don't wish those to be displayed, then please dial off the call and pick up the recording once we post that online. In terms of how we operate these sessions, if you wouldn't mind leaving your camera and your mic off while we're presenting. Obviously, if you want to ask a question, then please feel free to switch on your camera and be sure to switch on your mic so we can hear you. We will provide sort of natural pauses during the presentation for people to ask questions, but and if you do wish to ask a question, please could you use the raising hand function in your toolbar. We'll also be using the chat, so if you want to post something while the presentation's underway, please use the chat function, and we'll seek to respond to that as we go through. For those who don't know me, my name's Kevin Pilley. I'm part of the Island Plan Review team, and joining me on the call today is my colleague Marion Jones, and Marion will be picking up any issues that arise during the chat or joining any part of the discussion. So the issues that we want to cover today, we'll provide a bit of background on the consultation phase of the Island Plan Review. We'll talk a little bit about the draft plan itself in terms of providing a bit of an overview, and then we'll pick up the key content of today, which is the natural environment. We want to highlight some of the areas in the strategic context part of the plan where there's reference to natural environment considerations, and then we'll talk specifically about those policies directly related to the natural environment before we just run through some issues at the end about how you can engage in the process. So that's the format for the session. So to kick off, then we will first of all look at the consultation phase of the draft island plan. So that was launched on the 19th of April, runs until the 12th of July. That period of consultation is open both to members of the public, stakeholders, and states members as well. And we would encourage people to engage in the process through the consultation portal that you'll find online through the gov.je links on the web page, where you can see the relevant sections of the plan and comment in relation to any specific policies or proposals. As I say, this is a consultation phase of the draft plan. It runs until the 12th of July. So you've got a few weeks left to make any formal comment should you wish to do so. The process once that consultation period has ended is that the Minister will consider all of the representations and amendments that have been raised during the consultation phase, together with states members' amendments, and the Minister will publish his initial response to those. So the Minister's response, together with the actual representation or amendment, will be then considered by planning inspectors who've been appointed to independently review the draft plan and all the representations made in relation to it. Those planning inspectors will hold an examination in public, form of planning inquiry, and that will take place probably in late October, early November. And they will use that inquiry to examine the key issues and points of contention within the draft plan as raised by representations, but they will consider all written representations as well. Following the examination, the inspectors will produce a report that will be made available to the Minister, who will publish that, and then States members have an opportunity to consider the report and lodge a second round of amendments related to any issues raised in the inspector's report. And the Minister also gets an opportunity to lodge his own amendments at that stage before everything's considered by the States in March 2022, when they will consider all the amendments and the potential adoption of the revised plan. So that's the timescale. In terms of the process of consultation, we're embarked on an active range of consultation events during this month and into early June. This is one of a series of webinars which are on sort of key themes in the plan. Some of those have happened already. If you weren't able to attend those and you're interested in those, recordings of those will be posted online on the Island Plan website. So some of the earlier ones are up there already, and we've got other themes to cover over the remainder of this month and into early June. So these are running on a Monday and a Wednesday generally. We're also running what we're calling planner surgeries on a Friday. So if you attend these events and you've got detailed issues or questions that you want to pursue, please use the planner surgery slots to follow that up. And after the session today, we'll send you a link around and you can book a slot with one of the members of the Island Plan Review team to discuss any issues on the Friday. So please make use of that if you want to talk to any members of the team directly. We're also visiting the parishes at the moment. So an Island Plan roadshow is going around all of the parishes. We were in St Saviour's last night. We're going to St John's today, St Lawrence tomorrow, and St Martin at the end of the week. And then there's a series of similar events next week. So if you want to come and speak to us in person, then please make use of those parish sessions. So those are some of the events that are happening. I'll pause there if anybody's got any queries or questions on the consultation phase. Can't see anything, so if not, I'll move into the next part of the presentation. So this is just really to provide a brief overview of the plan. So the plan itself comprises both a written statement of the Island Plan together with a series of proposals maps. We've produced 4 of those this time around, simply because the level of detail that's set out on the maps, and I'll run through those in a minute. We do have an interactive GIS proposals map that's online, and if you follow the link, that will take you to the interactive version that you can zoom in and out of, which is a bit clearer than some of the PDFs that are also available online. So if you use that link, that should take you to the right section of the website for the map detail. As I said, a series of maps, so 2 at island-wide scale. First of all, a planning proposals map, a zoning map, and then a flood risk map, and the same is repeated for the inset map for town. In terms of the structure of the plan, there are 2 sort of volumes at the start of the plan provide the overarching strategic context for the preparation of the plan, with a series of strategic proposals which highlight those priority areas of work that need to be undertaken during the bridging plan period, together with a series of strategic policies, some of which I'll touch on in a minute, together with a new section of the plan related to a new policy framework that sets out overarching policies for key places in the island. And as I say, I'll touch on some of that in a moment. And then there's a series of thematic chapters, and obviously today we will be focusing on the natural environment section of the thematic chapters. The last part of the plan sets out a performance and delivery framework, just setting out how the plan is proposed to be monitored over the plan period. There are just under 100 policies within the plan. they're set out as a requirement in law for us to set out the policies with a clear justification, and that's set out in the preamble to each policy. Policies are set out in the blue boxes, so they're the tools that will be used in determining planning applications. But there's also a series of proposals in the plan which may relate to preparation of additional supplementary planning guidance to support the plan, or relate to specific proposals for key areas of land or areas of the island. So that's the structure of the plan. It should be read as a whole. Policies shouldn't be considered in isolation, particularly in the case of determining planning applications. So it's important to have regard not only to the relevant thematic policies that might apply to a proposal, but also the strategic policies and context that's set out in the document. It's worth mentioning that the preparation of the draft plan is supported by a range of studies commissioned as part of the evidence base for the plan, and some of those were published in advance of the plan being released. Some were published with the plan. The only remaining item to be published is the sustainability appraisal, which will be released imminently. So that should come out probably either later today or tomorrow. There are a series of independent studies that have been done to look at various aspects of the plan, sustainability appraisal being one of those. They are open to both to review and to comment upon. So, as I say, sustainability appraisal looks at the overall sustainability of the plan. That's been produced independently. Likewise, a viability appraisal looks at the whether the plan is deliverable and will function in terms of its economic viability. And lastly, a children's rights impact assessment, looking specifically at how the plan relates to children's rights. So that's part of the evidence base, which is all available online. As I said, the session today will focus specifically on natural environment, some of which is embedded in the strategic policies and place as parts of the plan. So before I dive into that, just an opportunity for any queries or questions on the structure of the plan or the evidence base. Nope. Okay, I'll carry on. So first of all, the strategic context for the plan. Before I dive into that, actually, just we've used just a bit of notation, a bit of summary for just to provide an indication as to whether policies are new or whether they've been changed to any significant degree relative to the current plan. So just a bit of an aide-memoire if you're looking at this at the end of the presentation. So strategic context for the plan. There are a number of strategic policies in the plan that have got particular relevance to the natural environment, and there are a range of these. So I'll just highlight some of the key elements from each policy as they relate to the natural environment. So first of all, there's a new policy in the plan that specifically sets out how the plan at strategic level might respond to climate change. And one of the issues of relevance to the natural environment is the location of development, and there's a focus in this plan of seeking to deliver most of the island's development needs from within the existing built-up area. That's obviously got policy ramifications for protection of the coast and the countryside, and likewise there's also recognition in the plan of the role of green infrastructure in terms of responding to climate change. So that gets explicit recognition in this strategic policy. I mentioned the spatial strategy in the plan, which looks to focus development in the island's existing built-up areas. This plan seeks to continue that strategy, which is a feature of the current plan. However, the draft plan distinguishes between the roles of different parts of the settlement hierarchy, and seeks to highlight the extent to which they might be expected to accommodate new development. But there's also the plan also has policy provision relating specifically to the coast, countryside, and marine environment, and I'll touch a little more on that. There's a specific policy in the plan talking about placemaking. Might be something that we associate with the urban environment, but of course it also relates to the rural environment. And there's a recognition of the explicit role that the islands, landscapes, and seascapes play in terms of helping to forge that sense of character and identity for the island. There's issues in here that are also picked up around the contribution that green infrastructure makes to placemaking. So that's obviously got relevance to natural environment considerations. I mentioned island identity and character, and again, that's reinforced in this strategic policy, the role that the natural environment plays in terms of contributing to the distinctiveness and character of Jersey. And then the natural environment also gets its own specific strategic policy in the plan, and that essentially sets out the strategic framework for the consideration of the natural environment, which then shapes the more detailed policy framework that follows in the remainder of the plan. So this gives a high priority to the protection and improvement of the island's landscape, seascapes, coastline, and also explicit recognition of that relative to biodiversity and geodiversity. So some changes of emphasis there in terms of this plan compared to the current plan in terms of the emphasis given to protection and improvement of biodiversity, and also for the first time explicit recognition of geodiversity value in the island, which is not something that's picked up in the policy regime of the current plan. So this policy sets out a requirement for all development to demonstrate how it's going to protect or improve those key elements of landscape and seascape character, and also biodiversity and geodiversity value. And it also makes recognition of the fact that whilst these considerations apply generally, there needs to be a consideration of impact on the particular quality of either a landscape or seascape character area, or a designated biodiversity or geodiversity site. And essentially all development should demonstrate how it avoids harm to both of those characteristics, and where harm isn't avoided, how it minimises, mitigates, or compensates for that impact. So those are the strategic policies that frame the natural environment in the plan. As I mentioned, a new feature of the draft plan is this specific consideration of places, and I just wanted to highlight two of these in the plan. The first is the plan that we have for town, and then also to touch on the place policy relating to the coast, countryside, and the marine environment. So the plan for town sets out a sort of overarching framework for development in St Helier, recognising that the role of St Helier in meeting the island's development needs is critical, but that's not to disregard the significance of consideration of things like access to open space for town residents, the importance of green infrastructure in town, and also to deal with this issue of the fact that biodiversity is not something that just exists in the rural environment or the marine environment. It's also an increasingly important consideration in urban contexts, and there's explicit recognition that urban biodiversity is something that needs to be considered explicitly through the planning process. So the plan for town is broken down into a number of strategic concepts, and there is this concept that's set forward that looks to restore town and have this focus on connections, both through town and into the countryside. As I say, this emphasis on urban biodiversity and the role of public open space. And the plan seeks to highlight where in the rest of the draft plan there are policy considerations that make reference to all of these issues, and that they will be material to proposals for development in St Helier. Moving on then to the place policy relating to the countryside, coast and the marine environment. Again, this seeks to reinforce that strategic consideration that there's a requirement to protect and improve the character and distinctiveness of the environment outside of the built-up area. And in this part of the plan and in this policy, we highlight the significance of the Coastal National Park and make reference to its particular character and its qualities, and also its purposes, which I'll touch on a little bit more in a second. Just get my slide to move on. Okay, so I mentioned earlier on that key parts of the plan have been supported by the preparation of an evidence base, and this draft island plan sets forward proposals to expand the island's coastal national park, and that's based specifically on a piece of work that was commissioned to critically review the coastal national park boundaries. This piece of work was brought forward because of some key challenges identified in the definition and operation of the current planning policy regime related to the coastal national park, and these are set out here. So this whole issue about is landscape being adequately protected in the coastal national park? Are its boundaries clearly defined? And what's the purpose of the national park, and how great a level of awareness is there out there, both within the island itself, but also beyond the island, in terms of the fact that Jersey has a national park. So those were some of the issues that this review sought to address. It was brought forward on a series of principles, and those principles are set out here. So it started on the assumption that any review would seek to build on the existing boundaries of the coastal national park. Perhaps most significantly, any review would assess the proposed boundary against a series of established criteria. So there's an objective basis of assessment there that can be considered and analysed when the proposed boundary is being scrutinised. It was proposed that one of the principles was that the boundaries should have more of a natural definition on the ground. Some of the boundaries in the current island plan for the coastal national park are based on sort of topographical features, such as sort of contour lines and things like that, which may not be obviously apparent on the ground. So this review sought to make the boundary of the park more clearly definable, in that they, as far as possible, relate to defined features on the ground. The review sought to avoid splitting designated areas, so to make sure that they were either wholly in or wholly out of the park boundary, and it generally sought to avoid built-up areas. And what we get as a result of that piece of work is as I say, a proposed extension to the coastal national park boundary. Significantly, that extension involves both terrestrial and marine extension in this current iteration. Previously, or currently, the coastal national park is limited to the mean high water mark, both on the island and in terms of the offshore reefs. So the review of the coastal national park boundary proposes extension into the marine environment. So as you can see from the diagram, that embraces the intertidal zones all around the island. together with what are the Ramsar boundaries for both the offshore reefs and also the southeast coast of the island. So that's the extension to the marine environment. In terms of the terrestrial extension, essentially the Coastal National Park seeks to provide seeks to embrace a sort of a wider visual buffer of the current Coastal National Park, and essentially embraces those areas at the top of the break of slope around the island's coastline. So that's particularly the case on the north coast, but there are sections where the current island plan, the current Coastal National Park, embraces coastal valleys. Now, which you can see, particularly in St Martin, around Roselle and St Catherine's. The proposed extension of the Coastal National Park, it still includes those coastal valleys, but also embraces the areas between them. And so much of St Martin is now pulled within the Coastal National Park definition, together with extensions of areas such as Screwville Marsh, also now more comprehensively embraced by the Coastal National Park proposed extension. In terms of the purposes of the Coastal National Park, they remain unchanged. They are set out in the current island plan, but I think this proposed plan gives them more explicit recognition in the policy regime, and that'll be apparent when we dip into the detailed policies themselves, as are the special qualities of the park. And again, they are articulated in the evidence base in terms of some of the qualities and character that are important to have regard to when considering development proposals in the Coastal National Park. So that's what I wanted to cover in terms of the strategic context for the natural environment. I'll pause there to see if there's any questions. I can see John has his hand raised, so just to pick up a question, John.
Yep, thank you. Well, disappointment at this end. I mean, flicking through the large book, 300 odd pages, draft bridging island plan. I mean, I'm aware that, if you look at the maths, less than half of 1% is the chapter on the environment. And I would have thought, post-COVID, everybody's talking about the environment. Everybody's talking about biodiversity. We've had various meetings where we've emphasised how important it is. So I just would like some assurance that the rest of the document and the rest of the island plan encompasses the importance of protecting the environment. And okay, there's only 18 pages, but maybe that's because there's so much else embedded in the island plan about protecting the environment and increasing biodiversity. My other disappointment, I went along to the Jersey National Coastal Parks seminars and workshops, and I had conversations about extending the national park. When you look at the plan, there's a huge gap around St Omens Bay, St Helier and St Clements. We've got lots of potential national park in St Helier, and I pointed out to your colleagues that were leading that seminar that areas like People's Park, Victoria Park, People's Park and going up West Mount, in fact Overdale itself, there's Valandre Woods, etc., would be beautiful to at least show St Helier that we could become part of the national park. So disappointment on this side. Perhaps you can give me some reassurance that that protection for the whole island and for the green areas in St Helier will be strongly protected in this plan. Thanks.
Okay, yeah, thanks, John. Yeah, first of all, picking up your point about the maybe the natural environment chapter is relatively thin compared to others. I'm not sure it's necessarily the best way to have regard to the significance of the issue. As I said, there are references to the natural environment throughout most of the strategic policies within the framing of the draft plan. So the significance of the issue, I think, is recognised throughout the plan, and as I said, that the plan needs to be read as a whole. So when development proposals are considered, regard needs to be had both to that strategic context as well as the specific policies that are designed to protect and improve the natural environment. Certainly the Minister is keen to ensure that there's a strengthening of the protection regime for the natural environment, and perhaps once we dip into the detailed policies themselves, you'll see that represented in the review of the policy regime. That was the, well, perhaps an additional point to raise in relation to that is, of course, that we're chunking up these presentations on a thematic basis. That's not to say that there aren't considerations of the natural environment that are referenced in other parts of the plan. So, for example, when we considered the general development policies in an earlier webinar, there are policies like the green backdrop zone policy, the shoreline zone policy that pick up key issues of resonance and relevance to the natural environment. And when we talk about the community infrastructure provision in the plan, there'll be consideration of policies relating to protection of open space. This is just a way of dealing with the plan in bite-sized chunks. Please don't view that as the only consideration of natural environment considerations. In terms of the Coastal National Park definition, as I said in the earlier slide, there's an objective analysis that sits behind the definition of the Coastal National Park boundary. The Coastal National Park is brought to St Helier in the fact that the intertidal zones are now embraced by the Coastal National Park, and obviously there's a visual relationship between a very strong one between St Helier and those parts of the Coastal National Park that might sit outside the parish boundary. Thinking of places like Noirmont, which obviously has a significant impact on the character of St Aubyn's Bay. As I just mentioned, there are. I think that it's important not to confuse the definition of the Coastal National Park with the fact that there are other parts of the island that are of high landscape value and character. But they might sit in a different context that makes them inappropriate to include within the Coastal National Park. But that's not to say that they still don't enjoy protection by other planning policy tools. And I can think of examples such as some of our inland valleys, some of that green backdrop that sits in the built up areas that does have an important contribution to landscape and townscape character, but isn't embraced in the Coastal National Park, but does have other planning policies that would seek to protect and improve them. Okay.
On the national parks thing, we have seen, although there seems to be national park and talk of protection, that St Bernard's Bay has been ruined by overdevelopment, and honestly, the backdrop of the greenery of St Helier ruined by a similar thing. I mean, much as I support Overdale, it would be pretty awful to look up from Elizabeth Castle and see that rising too high above the horizon. Just quickly moving on, about protection about the environment, what's happening about the protection of trees? I mean, we see too often trees getting felled and no replacements. In fact, I've had a message this morning that workers are felling the trees along the railway walk between the Moy School and the old McKennivet School. Now, allegedly, because the black pines are diseased. But this is going to be having a great effect on the wildlife, especially the loss of habitat for squirrels and birds. And there's no talk whatsoever, because somebody spoke to the workman there, about replacement. So I don't know how many trees are getting taken down, but this is just another example of the loss of trees because we haven't got tree protection. So could you just talk to us about tree protection?
Yeah, we'll cover that when we cover a specific policy in the plan. But just as a general point, it's probably worth just noting that the Minister for the Environment is looking to secure changes to the planning and building law to give greater control and regulation over the management and removal of trees. So that's not an island plan issue per se, but it's a regulatory issue that the minister is seeking to address by changes to the law. I can see another
I was going to say the Isle of Man's got great legislation, so I hope he's going to look at that. Thanks. I'll let you.
Yeah, possibly fewer trees than Jersey, but let's take another question from. I see Glyn has got his hand raised.
Hi, can you hear me all right? Sorry.
Yep, we can hear you. Thanks.
The connection's a bit. Just the narrative that's used throughout the interim island plan is not really judging developments for their values to embrace nature and how they are actually in harmony with nature. That phrase, in harmony nature, is actually a key headliner for all of the 17 sustainable development goals which the government of Jersey have signed up to. Just listening to your narrative that you are using here on how to actually judge developments, the language you're using is sort of like avoiding harm, mitigating against harm. Now that isn't in harmony with nature. I would like to see it a lot stronger emphasis put on how developments are actually in harmony with nature and judge them accordingly. Thank you.
Okay, thanks for that. And again, we might pick up on that when we get into some of the detail of the specific policies themselves. So perhaps an issue to pick up in a second. Okay, so I can't see any other questions at this stage, so we'll consider the detailed policies themselves. So the 3 policies to cover, together with a number of proposals. So firstly, the key policy in this chapter, insofar as biodiversity and geodiversity is concerned, and that's around policy NE1, which seeks to ensure that development protects or improves biodiversity and geodiversity. And again, the policy seeks to give emphasis to the fact that this isn't just a consideration in the rural or marine environment. It also applies throughout the island, including the built-up areas. The policy, whilst the policy does apply universally, it does recognise that we do have particular areas of biodiversity and geodiversity value on the island, and they are given the highest level of protection in the plan, and that relates to those sites that are designated as sites of special interest, together with those areas in the marine environment designated as marine protection areas or Ramsar sites. Where development does come forward and does cause harm to biodiversity or geodiversity, those proposals will be assessed against a series of tests, and you can see those tests that are set out in the slide. To enable a proper assessment of that, it's important that planning applications are supported with sufficient level of information. Firstly, about the baseline of biodiversity and geodiversity that applies in terms of a particular development site, and then around an assessment of the potential impact of development on those key interests. So in terms of those sites of biodiversity and geodiversity value, the plan seeks to highlight those and to indicate where they exist, but also makes reference to the fact that, as I say, it's not just about considering this in isolation in terms of those designated sites, but having regard to biodiversity and geodiversity throughout the island, and that also includes the marine environment. And some work's been done by colleagues in the marine resources team to start to map those areas of high habitat value in the marine environment, and that'll be important information in terms of informing the plan where development may impact the marine environment. Picking up perhaps the point that Glyn just raised, one of the issues that we raise in the plan is this concept of biodiversity net gain. And this is a concept that is gaining traction in other places where it essentially involves an approach to development such that development should leave behind it the natural environment in a better state than it was before the development took place. So that's a concept that's starting to be, as I say, introduced in other places. They're looking to bring forward legislation in the UK, for example, that requires this to be an explicit consideration in the development process there. We want to explore how that might operate in a Jersey context, and so therefore there's a proposal set out in the plan that seeks to ensure that we undertake further work in this bridging plan period to look at how biodiversity net gain might be introduced as a concept in Jersey and brought forward in the subsequent island plan review. Also, another element of that is this notion of urban greening, which is something that the London plan has sought to introduce. So a concept similar to the biodiversity net gain principle. And again, that's something we can explore and look at its applicability to Jersey. So that's in relation to future work. What the Minister has sought to do and has made policy provision for in this bridging island plan is that as part of the works that might be undertaken to see how this might be realised in Jersey, we would seek to work with government-sponsored development over the bridging plan period to see how biodiversity net gain might be delivered during the bridging plan period. So developments that are brought forward by agencies such as the States of Jersey Development Company or Andium Homes, we would seek to work with them to explore how biodiversity net gain might work in a Jersey context. Probably also relevant to note that the recently introduced wildlife law in Jersey imposes a specific duty on public bodies to demonstrate how they've contributed positively towards biodiversity net gain. So I think that adds sort of power to the Minister's elbow to seek to introduce this through the planning system. So that's the first policy in the natural environment section of the plan. The second picks up on this issue of green infrastructure and networks. And when we talk about green infrastructure, what do we mean by that? Well, essentially, as it says on the tin, all of those sort of green elements of the environment. So parks, gardens, playing fields, hedgerows, trees, and anything that makes a contribution to the natural environment. They form, so all of those elements of green infrastructure form what we call part of the island's green infrastructure network. And there's an emphasis here in the plan that development should protect and improve green infrastructure. It shouldn't harm the integrity of the existing green infrastructure that we've got. So it should retain and improve existing green infrastructure on sites, and it should make a positive contribution to that. And again, similar provision about where harm's caused. There needs to be a demonstration that the value of the development outweighs harm, but then there should be plans to mitigate or compensate for any impact on green infrastructure. There's also an associated proposal with this policy that looks to develop a comprehensive green infrastructure network strategy for the island. This is based on some work that colleagues in the natural environment team have commissioned, looking at the modelling of the sort of potential to enhance the island's green infrastructure network, looking at the location and incidence of key species throughout the island. And I think there's a clear recognition that simply by protecting designated sites, we can't, that's not a sustainable way to manage the island's stock of biodiversity, there needs to be a wider recognition that it's not just the designated sites that are important, but it's the connections between those designated sites and also the environment in its totality that has to have regard to considerations of biodiversity and green infrastructure. So again, this sort of picks up on the point that it's not just about the rural environment, it's also about the urban environment. Appreciate that the slide here just shows the modelling that's been undertaken in the rural parts of the island. Indicator species have also been identified and modelled for the urban environment as well. So that's a proposal again to carry out an additional piece of work to strengthen our understanding of the opportunities for strengthening the island's green infrastructure network and looking at how we might identify and address any deficiencies and opportunities to strengthen that. And then lastly, in the policy suite is this policy on landscape and seascape character. So the policy provision here is that development must protect or improve landscape and seascape character where that applies throughout the area outside of the built-up area. So this embraces what we call both green zone and coastal national park, and also the remainder of the marine environment out to territorial limits. In terms of the application of this policy, as I said earlier, however, this policy does seek to highlight the significance of the coastal national park and its setting. So it's important that consideration is given to the impact of development, not just on the park, the boundary of the park itself, but also on development that might be outside of the park that have an impact on its setting. And there's a policy obligation here to protect or improve the special qualities of the coastal national park, as previously referred to, and also development should be compatible with those purposes. So key amongst those is protection and improvement of its landscape and seascape character. So again, series of tests for development which might serve to or might cause harm to landscape and seascape character, and these tests will apply wherever development has an impact on landscape and seascape character. Again, there's a requirement for development to demonstrate a clear understanding of the context within which it takes place, and to demonstrate a clear understanding of the impact of the development on that place. And this is where great significance is placed against some of the evidence base that's been prepared for the draft island plan. We commissioned a review of the existing countryside character appraisal for Jersey, which was undertaken in 1999. So that's served to support planning policy in the previous couple of island plans. We've refreshed that evidence base to develop a integrated landscape and seascape character assessment for the entire bailiwick. So this covers not just the terrestrial parts of the island, but also extends out to the territorial limits. So there's now explicit policy consideration for impact of development on the marine environment, but perhaps most importantly, the relationship between the marine environment and the island itself, and the specific regard needs to be had to the impact of development on the island in terms of its coastal character in particular. What this piece of work has done is sought to refresh our understanding of the quality and the nature of the constituent parts of the island's landscape and seascape, and it's presented that to us in a series of landscape character areas, which are identified throughout the island and defined in the ILSCA. Importantly, it breaks these down into each character type has distinct areas that are identified within it. So if I take an example, if you take the coastal plain, is identified as a character type, and you can see that by the sort of deeper blue on the plan, and within the study, it identifies the different characteristics of the coastal plain as they appear in different parts of the island. So, for example, the coastal plain in St Clement and Grouville has a different characteristic to the coastal plain in St Juan, by way of example. So those differences need to be fully acknowledged and understood in terms of how we treat development proposals. And it might be that the capacity to accommodate and absorb more developments is greater in one character area than it is in another, even though they might be within the same character type. So this is a key tool in helping to assess the ability of the landscape to accommodate new development, and will be a key consideration in planning decisions. As I said, one of the important shifts in emphasis in this plan is the recognition that development, particularly around the coast, needs to be considered not only in terms of its landward context, but also its seaward context. And to help us do that, the ILSCA defines a series of coastal units, and these are set out and described in that piece of work. And the importance of these pieces of these tools is that they recognise that whilst development might take place in a particular character type or area, the likelihood is that that development might have an impact on a wider area of character. So let's take, for example, a development somewhere in St Aubyn's Bay. If it's of a particular scale, whilst it may be, it might even be situated in the urban environment, it's going to have an impact on a wider sphere of influence across perhaps a range of character types. And the importance of the coastal units is that they require developments to demonstrate that consideration's been given to the wider impact of the development on the wider area, both from a landward perspective, but also a seaward perspective, and also the relationship between the two. So an important shift of emphasis in the plan, and that's recognised in the policy provision and supported by some of the supplementary planning guidance. And finally, the last issue to raise is that associated with this last policy area is another proposal in the plan. This is a carryover from the current plan, which is about exploring the possibility of changing the permitted development rights in the Coastal National Park. And permitted development rights are set out in planning legislation, and they govern they effectively set the rules for what requires planning permission and what doesn't. And at the moment, permitted development rights in the Coastal National Park are the same as they are for areas outside of the Coastal National Park. And it may be that because of the high landscape quality and value of the Coastal National Park, together with sensitivity, that those permitted development rights ought to be changed such that more or greater level of development activity might be construed as requiring planning permission in the Coastal National Park, in order to ensure that there's greater regulation of change and the impact of that change in that sensitive landscape setting. So that's a proposal that's set out in the plan. In order to bring that forward would require amendment to secondary legislation, which of itself would require public consultation. So the plan isn't setting the rules as such, it's just suggesting that the rules might be changed, and there would be a separate process by which that would be gone through. So those are the key areas of policy and proposals as they affect the natural environment in the draft plan. So I'll pause there and provide an opportunity for any questions. If anyone has any?
I've got a question, Kevin, if I may.
Yeah, fire away.
Thank you for that. Sorry, I arrived a little late, but it's obviously a huge amount of effort been put into commissioning reports and studies like the countryside character appraisal to kind of introduce into the plan. Where I'm struggling to see much effort is in any sort of coordinated plan to set out St Heliers' new public parks or green spaces. Obviously, we're aware that St Heliers is going to be taking the brunt of most of the new housing in the island, but it's desperately short, I think, of green spaces, and the plan doesn't seem to really get to grips with that.
Yeah, I don't know if you caught the discussion with John. John raised perhaps a sort of related point earlier on. John Baker from St Helier earlier on. When we do the webinar related to community infrastructure, there'll be some consideration of how the plan seeks to both protect and enhance provision of open space, particularly in town. So there's policy provision in the plan to protect existing open space. There's policy provision in the plan to require new development to bring forward open space as part of as an integral element of development. And that's both in terms of general open space provision, but also there's a specific policy requirement to bring forward things like children's play space, with key thresholds for different levels of development to bring that forward. So the plan seeks to set that out in the community infrastructure section. There are also proposals in the plan to enhance the level of open space, particularly for town residents, in terms of specific proposals. And there are three key proposals in that respect. One of which is to bring forward the current state's decision to provide an extension to the Millennium Town Park, but also to provide town residents with opportunities to access the countryside and to access new open space at Grand Vaux Reservoir and the valley at Grand Vaux behind, up to La Commune in St Saviour, together with the proposal to designate a country park at Warwick Farm.
Yeah,
So,
I saw that, Kevin, and it almost highlights, I think, my concern that to me, the idea of a plan is that you plan things. So planning one park in central St Helier seems to me to be a real missed opportunity. And I get the idea, of course, I get the idea of developments having better green shared amenity space, but the result of that potential policy is just going to be a piecemeal approach to delivering green space. I would like to see a much more coordinated, cohesive, actual plan to designate areas that are strategically in the right place to deliver proper green spaces in a more coordinated way, and that doesn't seem to have happened at all.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple of points to make in response to that. I think this is a bridging island plan, so it's a short-term plan, and there are. I think what the plan does, it seeks to emphasise the role and significance of open space to the quality of urban life, and I think there's a piece of work that's been undertaken to look at to audit the open space that we have in St Helier and to assess that against some benchmarks for open space provision. And what that demonstrates is that there's some clear disparities and discrepancies in terms of the level of open space provision made in St Helier. So I think that's recognised. In terms of seeking to respond to that, as I say, the plan makes provision for new development to provide that. But I think it's worth acknowledging that there are pieces of work that are underway within government that seek to ensure that open space provision is enhanced, and that the requirement for open space, particularly in an urban environment, is categorically considered as part of the decision-making process. So we have two pieces of work that are emerging. One is the active places strategy, which is being brought forward, which seeks to promote more activity amongst islanders, but particularly to afford those opportunities for access to open space in town. And there are some key recommendations there relating to the potential opportunities at places like Springfield, depending on what happens with the island's sports estate, if you like. And then there's also other key pieces of work looking at more corporately how the island's public estate is used. And I think what is apparent is that there's a clear recognition that when government is looking at the future use of public land, that shouldn't be limited or constrained to use of its land estate for things such as housing, for example. There may also be a legitimate requirement to look at that space for other uses, such as open space. And we can see political debate already taking place over things like the use of future use of the land at Rouge Bouillon, for example, in terms of whether that might be continued to be used by emergency services, or whether it might perform an education role, or whether it might be released to provide other functions. So I think as we see key pieces of the public estate be released for other uses, open space provision will be one of those considerations. And of course, there are sites such as the current hospital site that will need to be considered in terms of its future use, if and when the existing hospital is relocated. So there's a wide range of public sites that can be considered relative to these requirements. And I think the other piece of work that's being undertaken is in relation to the education estate. So colleagues in education are embarking on a major reform of education provision across the island, but also critically looking at the education estate in St Helier, and that may afford opportunity to potentially release sites to other uses as well. So there are opportunities there. I think it's fair to say that the plan doesn't provide those in a comprehensive way at the moment, but that's simply a reflection of the fact that there are some emergent pieces of work that could inform the subsequent review of the island plan to provide a more cohesive response to that issue. I can see a question from Glyn. Is that your hand up from last time, Glyn, or have you got a new question?
No, I've got a new question, Kevin.
Okay,
thank you very much. One of the areas which I've seen seems to be missing from, again, this area of the island plan is agriculture's involvement in the natural environment. Obviously, agriculture plays a massive role in its impact on the natural environment, and that can be positive or negative. I'd like to say I'm currently sitting at Warwick Farm, and I'm pretty hurt that it's going to be considered as a natural park, or a sort of a park potentially, but I won't get into that. But it's just another thing where agriculture can be very, very beneficial to the natural environment, and really needs a lot more consideration for its role in enhancing or depleting the natural environment. And I'm very surprised it hasn't actually come up in this segment, what you've just talked about. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Glyn. Yeah, I mean, clearly as you say, agriculture has a huge influence in terms of its impact on the quality of the natural environment, on the character. Much of the character of the island's landscape is imbued by the agricultural activity that takes place there. So, I think there is some recognition of that. Parts of the island plan talk about the role of the countryside in particular in terms of providing a function relative to the sort of health and well-being of islanders, and there's provision in the plan about promoting access to the countryside and effectively opening up the countryside to greater access. And as you say, agriculture can play a role in that. And I think clearly the island plan is limited to its legal framework within which it operates, which is effectively the development world, the role of development activity. There's a whole range of other initiatives, some of which are being sponsored through government to support a more beneficial contribution of agriculture to the island's environment. But also I'm aware that there are various commercial imperatives also for farmers to behave in a more sort of environmentally beneficial manner, and that their activities make a positive contribution to the natural environment.
So just to come back on that, if I may, very quickly, Kevin.
Yeah, sure.
This goes back to one thing that you do have in your power as government, and that's the Sustainable Development Goals. I don't think the Sustainable Development Goals have actually been looked at deep enough, and the fact that the overarching, I'll put the link into the chat, by the way, and if you read through those, you can see the power of these Sustainable Development Goals in actually deciding whether a particular practice or development from any sector is in harmony with nature or not, which would be a very easy way to actually judge and allow or permit anything. That's just my observation. Thank you.
Okay, thanks for that. Yeah, I mean, it might be worth a look at the performance framework that we're proposing to adopt for the plan. That's whilst it isn't based on the Sustainable Development Goals, it's a number of the themes of the Sustainable Development Goals are picked up in the monitoring framework, which is derived from the Future Jersey work that was undertaken with islanders to set out some key objectives for the island. So there is some parallels between the two, but I note your comments. I can see Paul has his hand raised.
Thanks, Kevin. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, can hear you.
Yeah. Just looking at your slide 42, the biodiversity and geodiversity designated sites maps.
Mm-hmm.
The paternosters don't appear to be shaded mauve as a marine protected area.
You might have me there, Paul. I'm not sure. It's an issue I'd need to check with my colleagues in the Marine Resources team as to whether that's correct or not. Just flicking back through the slides.
Yeah, I would have thought that it would have stood equally alongside the Ecriho and the Minkies.
Yeah, I mean, what that's showing, I think, is it's certainly defined as a Ramsar site. I think I'm right in saying that.
Yes.
I'm not sure. I'm not entirely au fait with the detail of the marine protection areas, but that's certainly an issue we can check out. So thanks for highlighting that.
No problem.
Okay, any other questions? Okay, well, the last part of the presentation today was really just to perhaps remind you that there are more themed webinars to come. If you wish to participate in those, as I said, we're running parish drop-in sessions. So I think we're at St John today, St Lawrence tomorrow, and St Martin at the weekend. 4 till 7 on weekdays and 10 till 1 at the weekend. You can see all of the material online on the Island Plan webpage. If there's any particular issues that you want to talk to us in more detail about, we will send around the link to for the planner surgeries on Friday, so you can book a slot with any member of the Island Plan Review team to talk through any issue. And if you do wish to make formal comment on the draft plan, please use the consultation portal. So if you want to make a representation in relation to the plan, then we need to formally register that as a comment through the either through the portal or by virtue of a submission to us in writing. So that can be through email or hard copy also, but we would encourage you to use the portal. So that was it for today. Thanks very much for your attendance. As I say, we will post the material online from the today's webinar. If there's nothing else to raise, thanks very much for attending, and look forward to seeing you soon. Thanks very much.